In the dim corridors of political history, few names echo with as much cunning and contradiction as Niccolò Machiavelli. His teachings, often misinterpreted as ruthless, are not merely a call to power, but a mirror to human nature. Among the sharpest of his insights lies a paradoxical command: never defend yourself. At first glance, it seems suicidal. In a world obsessed with image and explanation, where the accused rush to justify, apologize, and rationalize, Machiavelli whispers something different: that defense is weakness cloaked in words. This is not about silence, it is about redirection. To defend is to kneel at the altar of someone else's narrative. The moment you justify, you acknowledge guilt, even if unspoken. You submit to a framework that was not yours to begin with. And in doing so, you lose control. Lorenzo, a young advisor in a fractured court of Renaissance Florence, once fell into this trap. Accused of conspiring against a rival house, he instinctively crafted long letters of defense, begged for audiences, explained every action with desperate eloquence. He thought words would restore his name, but Machiavelli, his silent observer and former mentor, only wrote one sentence in response: "You have already lost." Because power does not chase truth, it rewards perception. And perception favors the one who seems least shaken. Lorenzo's fall was not because of guilt, there was none. His fall was because he chose to defend rather than to deflect. The court saw not a man of honor, but a man who lacked control over his own image. So what should he have done? Machiavelli would say. Attack, don't explain. Shift. Don't absorb if accused of betrayal. Question your accuser's loyalty. If questioned about your intentions, raise doubts about the questioner's motives. If they try to diminish you, behave as though you have already won. Refusing to defend, you force the world to choose between doubt and dominance, and doubt, oddly enough, is less destructive than appearing weak. This strategy lives far beyond Renaissance politics. It infects the courtroom, the boardroom, the classroom, and even the quiet dynamics between lovers. How many times do we destroy ourselves trying to defend what we never needed to? "But I didn't mean to" is a dagger to dignity. Why? Do we feel the urge to explain ourselves? Because deep down, we are not trying to prove innocence, we are trying to be loved again. But power does not love. Power respects position, distance, mystery. This Machiavelli understood, and so he writes with a pen dipped in irony that the lion does not concern itself with the opinion of sheep. He writes of Cesare Borgia, a man who, when slandered, responded not with words, but with a spectacular feast and new alliances. He rewrote the narrative not by defending, but by ascending. This is not cruelty, it is strategy. There is a cold elegance in choosing what you allow to live inside people's minds. In modern times, we often confuse authenticity with vulnerability at all costs. But authenticity without control is emotional suicide. Not all truths deserve the air. Not every explanation needs to be offered. In fact, the strongest individuals are often those who allow misunderstanding to live because they know something deeper. Real power is not clarity. Real power is control over ambiguity. You may ask, but what if I am innocent? Are wrong about me? Then be innocent by being unbothered. Then win, not by argument, but by outcome. Machiavelli does not deny justice, simply mistrusts its delivery. To practice this principle is to train yourself in discomfort. It is to endure the temporary sting of false accusation in exchange for the longer game of preserved authority. It is to watch the storm pass over you, unmoved, and let others exhaust themselves in wind and fury while you remain stone. It requires philosophical discipline, the kind that does not beg to be understood, but chooses instead to be inevitable. And here lies the heart of it all. To defend yourself is to forget you are the sun. The sun does not argue with clouds. It waits. It burns through. The same applies to leaders, thinkers, artists even. Lovers, there is immense power in silence when that silence is chosen. There is immense violence in softness when that softness is strategic. There is a revolution in your restraint. So, next time the world demands that you explain yourself, Ask instead, who benefits if I speak? Who suffers if I don't? In the shadow of these questions, Machiavelli still smiles. He smiles not because he was cruel, but because he understood. A fundamental law of power. You never truly win by defending. You win by shaping what others must. Defend. And that is how power flips. Not with a scream, but with a smirk. Months passed. Lorenzo, once a rising political mind, now wandered the city with the ghost of what he used to be lingering behind each step. He had spoken too much, explained too often, apologized too sincerely. Florence had devoured him for it. But exile, whether literal or social, does not always signal defeat. Sometimes it clears the noise long enough for something more dangerous to grow. Understanding, it was in a villa on the outskirts, surrounded by olive trees and forgotten statues, that Lorenzo received a letter. It had no name, no seal, just 5 words. Your defense was your defeat. He knew the handwriting. Niccolo, alongside the letter, was a copy of the Prince, annotated in the margins, not with answers, but with questions. Machiavelli, as always, taught not with clarity, but with contradiction. One note read, "You seek to be right." But power lives in being above the need to be right. Another, "Never explain yourself. Confusion is a throne if you sit confidently upon it." Lorenzo closed the book and for the first time felt rage not at the world, but at his own instinct. To be loved. That's what had destroyed him, not the accusation, the rivals, but his aching desire to be seen as good. It was then that he whispered, not to Machiavelli, but to himself, "I don't want to be loved anymore. I want to be understood or feared." But how? Power, like philosophy, is never static. It flows toward the void, the space unclaimed, the silence unbroken, the question unanswered. Lorenzo began his return not by entering the city, but by re-entering the conversations people had about him. He fed rumors. He planted whispers. He allowed stories to circulate that he had uncovered a deeper conspiracy, that his silence was not cowardice, but preparation, that he would return not for revenge, but for replacement. His first appearance was at a funeral. A minor noble had died, someone connected distantly to the court. Lorenzo arrived in black, alone, and said nothing. But he was seen. His posture was steady. His gaze was still. His lack of speech louder than any defense he could have ever mounted. Machiavelli had once written, "Men judge more by the eyes than the hands, for everyone sees what you appear to be." And Lorenzo appeared calm, which made him dangerous soon. Former allies reached out not to apologize, but to inquire. They were nervous. They weren't sure what he knew. They feared he knew more than he ever said. Fear became his weapon. The irony. Lorenzo had no plan for vengeance. He had no secret knowledge, but perception obeys presence, and he was present again. This time not as a pleader, but as a phantom. Phantoms are more powerful than princes. He remembered Machiavelli's. A story of Cesare Borgia, who staged betrayals so that he could later appear as savior. Power, Machiavelli taught, is not always possessed. Sometimes it's performed. And the performance becomes reality. Lorenzo adopted this completely. He said nothing about the past, never clarified the old accusations, never corrected the rumors, and this made him untouchable. He was no longer a man with a defense, he was a mystery with momentum. This idea is that ambiguity is armor is profoundly philosophical. Socrates, after all, never gave final answers, he asked. He circled. He let others unravel themselves trying to trap him. And he, like Machiavelli, understood that the person who speaks least often wields the most silence. Modern minds resist. This we crave explanation. We rush to publish, to tweet, to clarify, but each defense is a thread we pull from our own dignity. To live as Lorenzo, to begin to live requires a deeper virtue. Detachment. You must detach from being seen as correct. Detach. From being loved by all, detach from the comfort of being understood. This detachment is not coldness, it's clarity. It's the realization that truth, if constantly defended, becomes just another prisoner in someone else's court. Lorenzo's return to court was not marked by a speech. It was marked by absence. At a major political gathering, a chair remained empty at the table. Yet his name was still there, a reminder that even when not present, he dictated the conversation. Power flipped, not because of violence or rhetoric, but because he refused to be pulled into a battlefield not of his choosing. He waited. He watched. He withheld. And by doing so, he reshaped the very terrain of perception. So what, then, is Machiavelli's final trick? It is to never fight where your enemy chooses the ground, and every defense. It's every explanation, every desperate justification is ground you did not choose. Choose mystery instead. Choose silence. Choose the illusion of knowledge. Let others talk themselves into weakness while you build your castle out of absence. Because true power does not speak. It commands without needing to explain. Lorenzo had once begged to be believed. Now he let them believe whatever they wanted, and they believed more because of it. Machiavelli, in his final margin note, wrote only this: if you must respond, respond with a question. If you must justify, justify with a smile. But if you can endure silence, you already rule. Winter fell upon Florence like a velvet glove, cold, but elegant. The city lights shimmered across the Arno River, reflecting the same illusions that flickered through the halls of power. And Lorenzo, no longer a mere man, now walked those halls. As an idea, but no idea lives alone. Shadows always seek the light that casts them. Her name was Isabetta. Brilliant, young, ruthless in her intellect, she had risen in the court not by seduction or alliance, but by philosophy. While others whispered rumors or bartered favors, she quoted Seneca and outmaneuvered men twice her age in council sessions. She spoke with the authority of reason, but harbored the thirst of ambition. And Lorenzo intrigued her. She had studied his fall and more dangerously his return. She saw in his silence not wisdom, but strategy. And in strategy, she saw a game worth playing. So she summoned him not with an invitation, but with a challenge. If you have truly nothing to defend, her note read, then you won't mind answering a few questions. Publicly, Lorenzo read the letter in silence. His advisor urged him to decline, to continue his reign of silence. But Machiavelli had once taught him something subtler. There are times when stepping into the arena is power, if you choose the rules. And so, Lorenzo replied with a single sentence, I will answer only the questions I create. Debate was to take place in the grand hall of Palazzo Vecchio, under frescoed ceilings and among skeptical nobles who had seen many rise and more fall. The court was curious. Was this Lorenzo's final act, or the unveiling of a new doctrine of influence? Isabetta stood poised, elegant in black, her hands clasped as if holding unseen weapons. Lorenzo arrived late, not by accident. Delay creates tension, and tension is control. He didn't look at her when he entered. He looked at the crowd and let them wonder. Isabetta began. Tell us, Lorenzo, if silence is strength, is speech surrender? He smiled faintly. Only, when speech is used to beg, then what of clarity? Isn't the philosopher's duty to clarify, not conceal? Clarity is a gift I give on my terms. A truth explained is no longer mine. It becomes yours, and I owe you nothing. The room stirred. She was sharp, but he was weathered. And weather is harder to predict than intellect. So you would rather be feared than understood? Understanding is unstable. Today they love you for it. Tomorrow they crucify you with it. But fear is reliable. It asks no gratitude. There it was. The Machiavellian seed now blooming in full view, but Isabetta was not shaken, if all men thought. As you, society would collapse. Trust would vanish. We would be ruled by ghosts. Lorenzo tilted his head. Perhaps, or perhaps ghosts make better rulers than desperate men. At least ghosts do not justify. The dialogue was not a debate, it was a duel. And what no one realized was that Lorenzo had already won, not because he answered better, but because he had framed the entire encounter as a performance. He had rewritten the purpose of the gathering. It was no longer about exposing him. It had become a lesson, a theater of philosophical war, where to defend was to lose. After the debate, the nobles spoke of him not as a man, but as a paradox. A philosopher who spoke like a tactician, a ghost who appeared only to disappear again. And Isabetta, she remained silent afterward. Not because she was defeated, but because something had awakened in her. She did not envy Lorenzo's power. She now understood it. Weeks later, she sent him another note. "You were right. Control does not begin when others listen. It begins when they stop knowing what to believe." He never replied. Philosophically, this moment reveals something timeless. Power is not the absence of opposition, it is the orchestration of uncertainty. Lorenzo's silence had not been pure detachment. It had been composition. He was composing fear, intrigue, admiration, and myth. He had become unknowable, and therefore unassailable. The Stoics taught that we should not be disturbed by what others say. Machiavelli pushed further. Not only should we ignore them, we should make their voices irrelevant. To do this, you must understand the art of narrative withdrawal, the ability to subtract yourself from their story, until they can no longer tell it without invoking your name. In awe, this is not cowardice. This is warfare. And so Lorenzo continued, not by amassing armies, but by mastering absence. He refused positions of power. He refused fame. He refused defense. And yet Florence bent around him. Why? Because in a world addicted to noise, silence is mistaken for supremacy. In a final note scribbled years later, found only after his death, Lorenzo had written, "Do not defend your life. Design it so that no one can define it but you. Be wind, not wall. Mystery, not martyr. When they accuse you, smile. That smile is your empire." Isabetta sat alone, overlooking the Arno, as the final winds of winter gave way to the silence of spring. The city, as always, played its games whispers in corridors. Alliances sealed in shadows, betrayals buried beneath courtesies. But something in her had changed since that debate with Lorenzo. Not because she lost, it's because she learned. And in learning, she began to unlearn everything she thought was true about power. For years, she had believed that power was earned through eloquence, proven through precision, polished through moral clarity. But Lorenzo had shattered that illusion not by opposing it, but by refusing to play its game. He didn't counter her arguments, he made them irrelevant. He didn't seek agreement, he orchestrated ambiguity. That was the lesson. Truth is not the throne. Perception is. And so, Isabetta vanished. Not from Florence, but from the noise. She declined invitations. She turned down appointments. Not replied to the Duke's letters, nor to the scholars who once praised her rhetoric. The silence she once despised, she now wielded. At first, it drew confusion, then anxiety, then fascination. "What is she planning?" they whispered. "Who is she meeting with?" She's still loyal, but there were no answers. And in that absence, a new kind of power began to form, the kind that doesn't knock on the door of influence, but waits behind it, already inside. Her transformation was not imitation. She did not seek to become Lorenzo. She studied him, yes. But, like a true philosopher, she did not mimic the master. She evolved the method. Lorenzo had used silence like a shield. Isabetta would use it like a mirror. She began appearing in places no one expected, not political councils, but artist salons, small theological circles, obscure metaphysical readings. In underground bookshops, she posed questions no one had the courage to ask. If power is perception, then is morality simply the manipulation of emotion? If defending yourself is weakness, is confession a kind of voluntary death? Is the difference between humility and strategic disappearance? Her words began to haunt the city. She was no longer seen as a political mind. She was becoming something more dangerous, a thinker unbound by loyalty to any side. She didn't need to command soldiers. She commanded doubt. And doubt is often the first step to surrender, and then came Emiliano. A boy, more than 17, orphaned by war, obsessed with books he could barely afford. He had heard both names. Lorenzo, the ghost of silence. Isabetta, the voice of questions. He admired them. Both. But he saw their contradictions not as failures, but as fuel. He approached Isabetta during one of her anonymous gatherings. "I've read all of Machiavelli," he said, trembling, "but something is missing." She studied him. "What's missing?" He hesitated. "The soul." A murmur rippled through the listeners. But Isabetta did not laugh. "Go on," she said. Emiliano continued. "Lorenzo's strength is silence. Yours is inquiry. But what moves the people? What makes them follow? Fear, love, or fight? I don't think it's logic or strategy. I think it's something beneath reason, something irrational, something sacred." She leaned forward. "You think the soul is the lever of power?" He nodded. "I think everyone obeys the unseen, whether it's God, fate, or memory. If power ignores the soul, it rules the body but loses the future." That night, Isabetta wrote a single sentence in her journal. "The next evolution of power is neither silence nor ambiguity. It is meaning." And she knew what she had to do. She would not return to the court to dominate it. She would return to reshape it, not by defending herself, not by defeating others, but by becoming the philosopher queen, the one who asked not just how to rule, but why ruling mattered at all. She began to write anonymously a series of treatises under the name Il Terzo Sguardo, the Third Gaze. These writings fused Machiavellian realism with metaphysical fire. They asked, what if power without meaning is just a beautiful prison? What if the soul of the state is not its laws, but its memory of suffering? What if the philosopher's role is not to ascend, but to descend into the collective dream? The city was shaken. Everyone wanted to know who the third gaze was. The clergy thought it was a heretic. The nobles thought it was Lorenzo. The students whispered that it was Isabetta. She never confirmed. She never denied. Because she had learned, never defend the truth. Let it defend itself. Philosophically, this next phase reveals a deeper insight. Power begins in silence, grows in ambiguity, but matures in meaning. Lorenzo had mastered the first two. Isabetta now pursued the third. She began mentoring Emiliano, not as a pupil, but as a reflection of the soul she had once ignored in pursuit of strategy. He taught her poetry. She taught him control. Together they forged a new possibility. Power not as dominance, but as design. Power not to rule over, but to awaken. Isabetta did not vanish into history. She became its compass, and the city changed around her. Lorenzo, watching from afar, wrote his final letter. You've learned the lesson. You've refused to defend yourself, and now they defend your ideas for you. This is the highest form of rule. When your silence becomes others' conviction. When your absence becomes their map. When your name is no longer needed because your thought is alive. Florence evolved, not with revolution, but with redefinition. The city no longer lived merely by the sword or the coin, but by the shape of ideas. A quiet renaissance of thought unfolded, and at the center of this invisible tide stood three figures. Lorenzo, the ghost; Isabetta, the mirror; Emiliano, the flame. They never ruled officially. They were never crowned nor titled. But their absence from power gave them something more potent, a myth. And myths don't die. They are believed. One cold spring morning, the Grand Council summoned a private assembly. Tensions had grown beneath the polished marble of Florence's noble houses. Once content with power games, now feared something more insidious, meaning the writings of Il Terzo Sguardo had penetrated too deeply. Artisans were quoting philosophy. Priests began questioning the alignment of dogma and state. Young soldiers refused blind obedience, citing the soul. The city had not rebelled, it had awakened, and nothing is more dangerous to control than a people who begin to think philosophically so. The council issued a decree. We must name this mind. We must unmask the third gaze. Because what cannot be named cannot be controlled. But when they arrived at Isabetta's door with parchment and threats, she greeted them not with soldiers, but with tea. You may unmask me, she said. But what you seek is already beyond. Me, they scoffed. Words are not beyond control. She smiled. Then you have not understood words, they demanded she recant. Denounce the writings. Apologize. Explain. Defend. And here in the final test of everything she had become. She simply answered, no. And that no echoed farther than any treatise, because in that moment, Isabetta lived what Machiavelli only hinted at, that refusing to defend oneself is not retreat, it is rebirth into something untouchable. She was exiled quietly, with dignity. The city could not afford to martyr her, nor could it afford to keep her visible. They hoped her name would fade, as dust upon history's shelves, but myths don't obey decrees, and Emiliano. He had watched it all unfold, not as a boy now, but as a man who understood both the price and the promise of power shaped by soul. He walked through the city square that week and noticed something strange. The silence had changed. It was not Lorenzo's silence, heavy and strategic, nor Isabetta's radiant and poised. It was the silence of a people waiting for something new to emerge from within themselves. The power had passed. It was no longer in the court. It was in conversation, in questions whispered by students, in glances exchanged by the thoughtful, in paintings that carried hidden truths, in sermons now colored by paradox instead of certainty. Emiliano didn't rise to fill the vacuum, refused to become a ruler. Instead, he published a final text unsigned, titled, "The Invisible Crown in It." He wrote, "He who defends himself gives his enemies their script. He who explains too soon writes his own ending. But he who walks through the fire without lifting, his voice teaches others to see flame as light. You do not need to win every argument. You only need to become the place where arguments lose their hunger. Never defend yourself because your enemies are not after truth. They are after your reaction. Deny them that, and you deny them everything." In the final years of his life, Lorenzo was seen only once, sitting under an olive tree near the outskirts of the city, smiling quietly as children read poetry aloud nearby. A girl asked him if he had once ruled Florence. He answered without turning, "I never ruled it. I just stopped needing to." Isabetta lived quietly by the sea. Sometimes, when waves crashed hard enough, she would whisper to herself, "Never defend yourself." Not because she had mastered it, but because it had finally mastered her. And Emiliano. He became what neither of them had, a whisper carried through generations. Not a prince, not a ghost, not a question, but a new kind of answer. Philosophical closing. The lesson remains. Ageless and undiminished. To defend is to lend power to thee. Accusation. To explain is to surrender the frame. To justify is to kneel at the altar of approval. But to remain, to withhold, to endure misunderstanding, this is not weakness. It is sovereignty of the mind. As Machiavelli knew, and these three proved, you flip power not by grasping it, by becoming the one thing it cannot define. You become unwritten, and in a world obsessed with control, what cannot be written rules all. END, but the ideas continue.